from Abuja.
It's all about the human struggle to raise the level of living. That's what it's all about. I'm Magnus Packle, and this is Magnus Packle GVA. I appreciate you being a part of our show. In view today, is Africa ready? We have the most acclaimed leader Nigeria has ever had in an exclusive discussion on this topic. We have His Excellency President Olusegun Obasanjo, former President of the Federal Republic of Nigeria. For this one, don't go away. But before that, in our quick view, what countries are growing the fastest in Africa? That's coming right up. Over the last 4 years, that is from 2009 to 2012, the 10 fastest growing economies in sub-Saharan Africa have been Sierra Leone, Zimbabwe, Ghana, Ethiopia, Rwanda, Nigeria, Mozambique, Zambia, Liberia, and Tanzania. Sierra Leone is the fastest growing economy in sub-Saharan Africa, averaging an annual rate of growth of about 8.6% over the last 4 years. The nation's economy has been growing steadily since the end of hostilities in 2002, as diamond prices have stayed high and there have been significant improvements in macroeconomic performance, with corruption trending lower. Zimbabwe averaged a real GDP growth rate of about 8.4% over the last 4 years, the second fastest during this period in sub-Saharan Africa. Since 2009, Zimbabwe has benefited from dollarization and other improvements in the macroeconomy, bringing to an end the era of hyperinflation and very high unemployment, which had climbed over 80%. Zimbabwe has also benefited from high commodity prices during this period. We will soon do a full discussion on fast-growing and slow-growing economies in sub-Saharan Africa. Still in view, our exclusive discussion with His Excellency President Obasanjo on Africa's readiness. President Obasanjo is by far the most acclaimed Nigerian leader. He was the key figure in administering the Biafran surrender and the no victor, no vanquished position of the federal government. He was a federal minister of works and housing, later becoming Chief of Staff, Supreme Headquarters. He became Nigeria's military ruler following the death of General Murtala Mohammed, and later presiding over the democratic elections won by Alhaji Shehu Shagari. In doing so, Obasanjo became Nigeria's first military ruler to hand over power to a democratically elected civilian government. In 1999, Obasanjo became president of Nigeria. After 8 remarkable years in office, in which he consolidated Nigeria's unity and became a foremost African and global leader, and a man of remarkable impact in the socio-political history of Nigeria, he successfully transferred power to another civilian administration for the first time in the history of Nigeria. President Obasanjo gave me the extraordinary opportunity to work for him and serve Nigeria as Chief Economic Advisor to the President and CEO of National Planning Commission, and then later as his principal aide on poverty eradication. Recently, we were privileged to visit President Obasanjo in his very beautiful home in Abeokuta. President Obasanjo has retired from government, but has not retired from public service. He is still a foremost Nigerian, African, and global leader. Still very engaging, attentive, and lucid. Please join me in my discussion with President Olusegun Obasanjo, GCFR, former President of the Federal Republic of Nigeria.
Sir,
you are probably the most extraordinary personality that I've ever known.
Probably you haven't met many people, or I gave you wrong impression, whichever.
But you are an extraordinary personality.
Thank you very much.
And now you are in retirement. If we call what you are doing retirement, doesn't look like retirement to me. But you say you're
as long
retirement.
as you still breathe the free air of God, you cannot retire from being good.
Yes.
So, well, retirement, you probably have a change of job. I used to wake up and feel, oh yes, what's happening in Kano, what's happening in Maiduguri, what's happening in Calabar. Now I don't have to worry about what's happening in each of those places, but I do worry about what happens in Nigeria, what's happening in Africa, and indeed what's happening in the world. So to that extent, you may say, yes, I have a change of concern, a change of preoccupation, but not retirement in that sense.
I was going to say, how does it look being retired from being president? But apparently you're still doing a lot of the things that you were doing before. So let me go right into it and say, now in the world today, people are talking about Africa rising. It's been in The Economist. They had a feature article on Africa rising, and people are talking about that. But question is, for somebody like yourself, a leader in Africa, is Africa really rising? What are the signs, to really show to the world and to give confidence, to people in Africa that Africa is indeed rising, if it is rising?
I think two things, basically. What we see of Africa in the first decade of the 21st century is markedly different from the Africa of the last 2 decades of the last century in a number of ways. If you talk about democracy in terms of election, Africa is rising comparatively.
Yes.
If you talk about the number of conflicts that we are facing in the first decade of the first 12 years into this century, and compared with the last 20 years of the last century, Africa is rising. Now, if you then go to the economic sector, and people will want to measure the economic growth, economic development in terms of GDP, and you know that better than myself. When you take the aggregates of about 5.6% GDP growth in Africa over the last decade, Africa is rising.
Absolutely.
Especially when people have written off Africa when we were doing, when our GDP growth was less than our population growth.
You just said what I was going to say, because I was going to say that in the 80s, the so-called lost decade, our GDP growth rate was about 2.4%, while population growth rate was close to 3%. We were suffering from misery growth, and now we're doing much better than that.
So when you take all these, those who are talking about Africa rising, you will give them some credence.
Absolutely, yes.
They know what they are talking about. But my own concern is that we have had this before. Immediately after independence in the early 60s, the prices of commodities were good. Cocoa, granite, coffee, tea, they were good. And as I did say recently, in one of my international traveling. We even built a cocoa house in Ibadan.
Yes.
But when things went down, we didn't have enough money to maintain the cocoa house that we built with cocoa money.
Yes.
Now, that is the situation that we found ourselves when things changed. And I believe we must not be complacent at this time, because Africa rising from the economic point of view, what is really making Africa to rise? Prices of commodities again, mainly natural resources,
yes.
But also a little bit of agricultural commodities. Now, a change can also come. Now, because that time, the experts and those who are advising us, even advise us that, oh yes, what do you need? You need where we bring components and knock them and put them together.
Yes.
There.
We were import substitution to bring it. Okay,
import substitution.
Yeah.
Now they say that's what we need. And then just bring the knock down, and then you come and put them here.
Yes.
And then when there was no money, we had nothing to bring.
Collapsed.
The whole thing collapsed. Yes. Now this time, we should tie our money down. We should tie our money to infrastructure.
Yes.
We should tie our money to education. We should tie our money to agriculture. We should tie our money to capacity building.
Yes.
And I believe that this time around, God has given us what I call a second chance.
Yes.
Now, we should not miss the second chance as we missed the first chance.
I was privileged because you put me in the position to travel around the world with you. And I saw you in your leadership with people like Mbeki, with Wad, with Bouteflika. When you were building the African Union and you were presenting it to the G8 and the world, there was so much hope. And we saw leadership. We had people with gravitas that you thought these guys can actually lead Africa there. So when you look at Africa today, are they carrying that mantle that people like you handed to them across the board in Africa?
Well, I think the system is still in place.
Okay.
The objectives are still right. The program that we put in place, there's still nothing to beat them. NEPAD, APRM,
yes.
The AU itself, the constitutive act of the AU, they're right. Of course, people have changed, and then you will expect that there be what is permanent is change. People will come but then people who come in should know the background. They should understand. They should be educated so that they can move forward from where they are taking over from. Now, part of our problem is that leaders don't even want to learn.
Yeah.
And I always say, to be a leader, you must be a reader. Now, you must read.
That's a good one.
You must go back and say, look, why was this done? You don't just come and condemn, or just come and reverse, or just come and deny.
Yes.
You must find out. And unless, like you rightly said, the Constitutive Act of AU, we sat down, we didn't even condemn OAU. We said OAU had achieved,
yes,
within its limited objective of decolonization,
yes,
political emancipation. Now, it didn't play too much emphasis on socio-economic issues. Now, we said AU must go a level higher.
Yes.
And that we put in. Now, what is the program we can use? As you said, Thabo Mbeki, Bouteflika, and myself, we find ourselves in the year 2000 in front of G7 they were then.
Yes.
In Tokyo, G7 plus Russia.
Russia.
And after we have finished with them, because I was sent there by G77 plus China, Thabo Mbeki was sent by Non-Aligned Movement, and Bouteflika was sent by OAU. After we are finished, we then look, they dismiss us within 30 minutes. Then we look at ourselves and say, look, hey, we are here fortuitously. 3 African leaders sent by 3 different organizations. Now, what is our message from Africa? What the messages we have brought now are from 3 different organizations, international organizations.
Yes.
But what is our message from
Africa? Yes.
That's how we bond together. We say, yes, we have a challenge. That's where NEPAD came from. That's where APRM came from. And we move on.
So what's the message now?
Those messages
yes.
are still relevant.
Okay.
Now, the point we are making is that, yes, there are new leaders. Well, the type of chemistry that existed between me, Thabo Mbeki, yes. and Bouteflika, you don't expect that it will exist. But they must find a way. They must find a way. The current leaders must find a way. They have to make progress. We have to challenge them to make progress.
Yes. So, China. I think that you were a pioneer African leader, to show to China to try to bridge a relationship. But the thing is, what China is looking for now, is it the same thing that you were presenting and looking to have with China at that time? Is China coming as a neo-colonialist, or China coming for African consumer market? China coming for our raw materials and natural resources, or China coming as a partner in progress, especially with trade?
Look, I thank you for the point you made about China. I got to know China fairly well during my interregnum. After I left office as a military head of state in 1979, I became part of a group, former heads of government.
Yeah.
In that group was Helmut Schmidt, Fukuda of Japan, Pierre Trudeau, Jimmy Callahan, Bertrand Borrero of Colombia. We were a bunch, Malcolm Fraser. So, and to me, it was a learning process, because we learn among ourselves, and we learned as we went around the world. And we went to China a couple of times. It was clear to me that by the middle of the 21st century, China will be leading the world. There's nothing you can do about it. Now, so right from there, I said to myself, should we wait until China becomes the leader of the world before we start getting our acts right with China? Or should we pro-act?
Yes.
Now, I decided we should pro-act. China must know more about us, and we must know more about China. But that does not mean that we should discard our old friends. In fact, my own belief is that old friends must be cherished.
Absolutely.
But you must also be free to make new friends. We have a problem with the West. They saw this boogie, China. Now, China should not be seen as
the boogeyman.
China must be seen as they see who China have the most of its fund buried in America.
Yeah.
If nobody has ever called China the colonial master of America, because of the...
That's a good point.
Yeah. Nobody... I think the Chinese have got it right. They know that there are certain things that they must do right in Africa and certain things that they must refrain from doing. I always say to them, I will be going to China again sometime next week. And I always say to them, please be sensitive to the situation in Africa. When you have Chinese on our roads trying to sell what area boys in Lagos should be selling, that may be offending against our sensitivity. Now, but if you bring Chinese engineers and they are taking part in the railway project or road project in very important and critical area, that's understandable. And I think they are also willing to give us loan at concessionary rate of interest.
Clearly, President Olusegun Obasanjo has been one of the most extraordinary leaders Africa has known in recent times. He says that Africa is ready to take the lead in world economic affairs, but has to do more in the area of economic integration and overlapping product demand. I agree with him and believe that in addition, for Africa to really take the lead, two things must happen. One, Africa must work to reduce the cost of production of goods and services by looking to reduce the cost of funds for investment and business. Two, Africa also has to provide the infrastructure and improved skill sets needed to raise productivity and drive overall output. Increased output would also mean increased participation in the economic development process. We must therefore have an inclusive economic arrangement where the use of the factors of production, especially labor, is optimized. If we do these things, Africa will rise. I'm Magnus Pakol, and that's my view.